am by training a sociologist and a social demographer, and I've always been interested in investigating factors that contribute to adolescent and young adult well-being. And so if you look at my CV, that's kind of the overarching theme as I connect family, health, and education in one way or another in most of my papers. And during the last 6 or 7 years, the bulk of my research has really focused on the consequences of adolescent and early adult weight for young people's lives. And so I have a stream of work on adolescent obesity and mental health, and that's largely been published, and so I decided I wouldn't present that, and I know somebody else was in recently and talked about mental health a little bit. And so the second stream that I'm still kind of getting off the ground with my colleague Margaret Whedon at RAND, who I also met through the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program. So it's kind of coming full circle that, I have all of these spirits and people back in this room together that were a part of the generation of this idea. We've been working a little bit on the way that early adult and adolescent weight influences family formation. And so the talk I'm going to give today is really the springboard for that larger research agenda that we're trying to pursue right now. We have a grant under review right now at the National Institute of Health, and another one that we're revising to send back to the National Institute of Health. And I had this wonderful interdisciplinary fellowship in women's health at Penn State that was funded through the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development that also helped us get the early stage of this project off of the ground. And so the bigger scope of this project is that we're trying to really understand how women's weight trajectories and fertility trajectories are intertwined, and it involves a lot of bidirectional processes. We're also trying to really push more on the different ways that weight socially matters for fertility. There's a big literature in the world of obstetrics and gynecology and assisted reproductive technology on the way that obesity influences fecundity among women as they're older, but not much has been really pushed on in terms of, what else might be going on that causes weight to press on women's fertility? And so we're trying to uncover some of that by thinking about the different ways that these relationships vary depending on women's social position and then also on social context and for different groups of women. But like I said, today I'm going to just kind of focus on where we started with this project and our initial study, which is under review, as sometimes often happens. This paper is still under review, and the second paper is actually forthcoming. But I thought I would still do the springboard piece because the other piece doesn't make as much sense without this one. And so this really focuses on the way that obesity during early adulthood influences women's life course fertility trajectories. And so we just focus on weight at one point in time and the fertility trajectory part. So we're not to the point where we're doing all of the intertwining together yet. And so a good place to start is always with the significance of obesity. As most of you know, or at least when I give this talk in the United States, everybody knows obesity receives a great deal of attention by the media and policymakers and researchers in the United States because Americans have really gotten quite heavy since the 1980s. More than 1 in 3 American men and women are obese, and so a significant proportion of the U.S. population is at risk of serious health and social consequences of the disease. And in fact, as a sociologist, what really kind of drove me to obesity when I went to the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program was the fact that obesity is a health status, but it's also a really consequential social status and a very stigmatized status. And so there's this way, it's this really interdisciplinary this multidimensional status that pushes on different aspects of people's lives in interesting ways. And the other thing for this particular project is that obesity is particularly stigmatizing for women. When you look at the literature on obesity in education, obesity in employment, obesity in marriage, women always suffer more from being obese than men because obesity and female beauty are still very strongly tied together. And in fact, some scholars, there are some feminist sociologists who have gone so far as to say that the tie between beauty and weight is so strong for women that they actually face a tyranny of slenderness. And there's a lot of research that talks about women and normative discontent about weight and the fact that even when women aren't overweight, they think they're overweight, and just it's a much bigger deal for women than for men in terms of thinking about it as a stigmatized status. But that said, we also know that obesity is clearly a physical status with a lot of negative health consequences. And one of the nice things that, it's not as recent anymore, but there's an early 2000 piece in the American Sociological Review that shows that not only does obesity matter right now, but there are also these life course consequences to being obese, and that early life obesity can actually have long-term deleterious consequences even if you lose that weight. So there's this way that being heavy early in your life can push on health in negative ways later, even if you actually take that excess weight off. And so when Maggie and I started thinking about these different ideas together, this trio of ideas is really what kind of motivated our study. And when we started to think about obesity as a multifaceted health and social status with especially deleterious consequences for women, we considered the fact that obesity's consequences accumulate over the life course. We began to realize that obesity may not just be stratifying people into negative positions that disadvantage their health and longevity long term, but for women, it might also be stratifying them into disadvantaged positions for bringing new life into the world as well. And so this became even more apparent to us when we began to think. Maggie is classically trained as a demographer, and I spent a lot of time at the Texas Population Research Center, although I wasn't a real demographer. Now I'm adopted by the real demographers, but at the time I wasn't. But when we started to think about demographic theory about fertility, and especially Baumgart's theory on the proximate determinants of fertility, is this something that's familiar to people in this room or not? Okay, we'll talk about it. I'm going to go through it. But when we started to think about this particular framework, it was originally used to study country-level fertility rates, and it was kind of used to explain how we ended up having these contexts with really high fertility. And eventually, over time, people started using it to think about, well, how do we end up with low fertility, and how do we think about what can we understand about individual level childbearing outcomes? And so when we started to think about weight being this multidimensional social status and health status, and this framework, it was like, wow, we can really understand that obesity has a much larger impact, we thought, on lifetime fertility than anyone had kind of ever realized by thinking just about weight as a clinical status. And so, according to the proximate determinants of fertility, this is all actually, it's this very fancy framework, Maggie and I think, for something that's really quite simple. Fertility involves three basic types of processes. So first of all, proximate determinants, So first of all, women have to have some sort of fertility exposure, and this is just a really fancy way of saying, for the most part, you need a sexual partner if you want to have a child. And so somebody always raises their hand and goes, but what about the fact that now there's assisted reproductive technology? And there is, but at least in the US context, it's still used relatively rare. It's used relatively later in life by a very, very small proportion of women, something like 2% of women, because it's also incredibly cost prohibitive. So for the most part, we still do need fertility exposure for most women to have kids. Then there's also the idea that natural fertility control is important. And this is just the basic idea that, you have to have a biological capacity to bear children. If you're infertile, if you don't ovulate, if you have an irregular ovulation cycle, if you don't actually have sex when you're fertile, this will all decrease your likelihood of being able to bear a child. And then finally, deliberate fertility control also influences childbearing. And this is just the idea that if women contracept, if women have abortions, you're much less likely to have a child than if you don't take those measures. And so it's just the idea that fertility requires all three of these different classes of determinants. And when we started to think about what we understood about weight from different disciplinary contexts, what we realized is that obesity clearly influenced each of these different proximate determinants. And so this is what made us go, ha-ha. We think we can start to understand the way weight might accumulate in different ways and push on different types of determinants in ways that not only influence whether or not a woman who wants to become pregnant right now actually has a baby, but actually influences women's entire fertility trajectories. So this is what we started to understand when we thought about this. So first of all, there are some clear reasons why obesity pushes on women's fertility exposure. And we talked a little bit about this, or I talked about this a little bit in the beginning of the talk. And this is basically the idea that, obesity places women in a disadvantaged status. Obesity influences whether or not women are rated as attractive. It influences whether or not women are rated as feminine. And physical attractiveness is still much more valued by men than women in terms of seeking sexual partners. That doesn't mean there's not homogamy involved and all of these other things. But again, physical appearance is more important for males seeking partners than for females. And so it then probably doesn't come as much surprise that there's a pretty large body of literature that shows that obesity is negatively related to romantic and sexual partnership. There's been several studies now that have shown that obese women, both as adolescents and young adults, date less frequently. They date at later ages. They experience sexual initiation later, and they're at greater risk of never marrying than their non-obese counterparts. And so there's this way that, all right, all of a sudden we're seeing, look, obesity is even impacting women's ability to get out of the starting gate. They can't even find a partner, and if they do find a partner, they're finding it later in life than their non-obese peers. Oh. And then there's also this notion, and this is actually where the big body of literature is that obesity really impacts different aspects of natural fertility control. Obese women are at increased risk of ovulation failure and infertility treatment that stems from all different types of medical conditions, including polycystic ovary syndrome. And then there's some controversy about which way that direction goes, but there's this linkage that basically obesity really changes the physiology of physiology of women in ways that increases their likelihood of ovulation failure. Miscarriage, in the bulk of the research on this study, there's some contradictory evidence, but for the most part, the bigger body of literature shows that miscarriage is more common among obese women who conceive naturally and among those who seek assisted reproductive treatments. And there's also quite a bit of literature that suggests that obese women, if they actually try and use assisted reproductive technologies, that the technologies are more likely to fail. And so there's also this notion now that we see, look, obese women's biological capacity to bear children is also diminished. And so when you start to all of a sudden think, okay, we have decreased fertility exposure, and now, so you're starting later, and so fecundity is already starting to drop, and now we have this decreased biological capacity. There's this way in which you can see obesity is accumulating and should be pushing on multiple processes and determinants in ways that should decrease fertility across the life course and not just at one particular moment in time. And so we finally get to this last class of proximate determinants. This is where we went, oh, darn it. When we look at this, there's a little bit of evidence that shows that maybe obesity doesn't work the same way. And basically there's a very small, very limited body of literature that shows that, so there's one study of rural women in one state in the United States that shows that obese women are less likely to contracept. And so we're like, okay, well maybe here's this way that we have this increased risk of childbearing. And then there's also one study of one Planned Parenthood clinic in upstate New York that showed that as BMI went up, women would choose to not have abortions versus have abortions. And so we're going, okay, there's this very limited body of research that shows maybe obesity could actually increase childbearing. But then the more we thought about it, it was like, well, that could be true. But for this to actually be something that's going on, these women have to find partners and have biological capacity. And so when we thought more about the way that obesity should be pressing the hardest, we think that it operates much more fully through these two pathways than through the last pathway, based on everything that we've done, and also some preliminary analysis of our own data to try and pull out, well, let's look at our data. Do we see these women contracepting less or not? And what we ended up finding is not enough cases where we could find women with partners who weren't, we had power issues, but basically even our preliminary analyses kind of started to show that these pathways may matter more than this pathway. And so when all of this is kind of taken together, this is what our final model that I'll discuss today looks like, and at least our final conceptual model, I should say, because I'm not going to get into testing the pathways today, and I can talk about why at the end. But basically, we end up with a hypothesis that obese women, young women who are obese during the early 20s, and that's where we kind of start with women. We start with adult women. We think about young adult women. Those obese women should have later timing of first birth and higher likelihood of childlessness than their non-obese counterparts, in large part because their fertility exposure is disrupted and they have decreased capacity for actual childbearing. Any questions? Okay. So, the research questions that I will answer for today, we're going to ask, do obese young women have lower lifetime parity? So are they actually having fewer numbers of children than their non-obese counterparts? Do they have a higher risk of remaining childless than their non-obese counterparts? And do they have later timing of first birth? And one of the reasons that we decided to really start to focus on fertility is because, the United States is an interesting case in such that a lot of industrialized countries, for the most, we start to see really declining fertility rates. And in the U.S., fertility rates certainly aren't high, but on average, they're still above replacement, and that's quite unusual. And there's still a very strong preference among American women to have at least 2 children. Even among more highly educated women, they're still having 2 or more kids more often than they're having 0 or 1. And so there's this way in which fertility is still very much in demand in the United States relative to other countries like Italy and France, where women don't want to have, where childbearing isn't as highly valued. And the U.S. is a very pro-natalist country relative to a lot of other countries that are similar to it. And so it really kind of to us made it imperative to start to think about whether women that were affected by this growing public health problem were were really at a disadvantage for childbearing. Because if they are, they're at a disadvantage for a lot more than just their health. They're at a disadvantage for an outcome that most women really actually still highly value in the United States. Okay, so how do we answer these questions? We do some quantitative analysis of a data set, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the MLSY 79. And these data were originally a sample of 12,686 14 to 22-year-old young men and women who were first interviewed in 1979. This is, to our knowledge, the best source of U.S. data for studying adult women's childbearing across the life course. So there are other data sets that are really great for studying first birth and more recent cohorts, but if you really want to capture the entire reproductive lifespan of women, there's a lot of evidence that this is one of the best data sets that you can do it with, because they collect data annually or biannually from 1979 to 2006. These years for the women in our study actually represent the period of their life from age 20 to 45 to 49 at the end, and so you're actually getting the entire reproductive trajectory. And so it's nice in that you can look at what happens over the course of women's lives. And so this is the most recent U.S. cohort for whom we have reproductive lifespan available. And the rich childbearing histories, along with women's reports of height and weight so early in their adult life course, kind of make it an ideal data set for doing a study like this. We made lots of sample constraints. We only used the women in our study. I can talk about why that is later. Men are very poor reporters of fertility, especially if it's non-marital fertility, and so there are all kinds of ways that they don't claim females as much. There are all kinds of ways that men are less reliable. And also, we don't think obesity should matter as much for them, so we focus on the women. Women had to participate in the 1981 survey when weight and height data were first collected. Our samples also constrained to women who didn't have children prior to 1981, so we're getting rid of a lot of early births here, and that's important for thinking about who these findings are generalizable to. And we also only focus on adult women, because when we looked at this, we found that adult women and teenagers are different, and I can also talk more about that at the end with anybody that's interested, but we focus on adult fertility, not on teenage fertility, which is much more likely to be non-marital and unplanned and lots of other things. And finally, our samples constrained to women who were systematically followed up by the NLSY through 2006, because these are the women that we have the most reliable childbearing histories for. So in the end, we have a total analytical sample of 1,433 women. And if you're interested, we saved all of our cases with missing data on any analytic variables. We use multiple imputation to replace missing data. These are our primary 2 outcomes. So we first of all look at childlessness and that should actually say 2006, because we just actually pulled in the most recent wave of data. The ends are about the same, because between 2004 and 2006, you have 40-year-old women, and they're not having many more kids. And so roughly, when you look at this, childlessness basically indicates whether or not women didn't have kids by the last survey wave. In our sample, almost 1 in 3 women were childless by 2006. And for those of you that know U.S. fertility, you were going to say, that's a really high number. And yes, it absolutely is, and that's because you have to recall we excluded women who didn't have births. We excluded women who had births prior to age 20, and so this is what happens when you get rid of the teen births. And when we compare these figures to census data and make that same constraint, we end up with pretty analogous findings in terms of percentages. And so we're still pretty much on in terms of, for our sample, this number makes sense. The average, our second variable is timing of first birth, and it's based on the survival time in years from 1981 until respondents' year of first birth. Among the women who hadn't given birth before 1981, with at least 1 birth by 2004, so this is also excluding women that didn't have births at all, the average age of birth was 27.63. Again, this number sounds really old when you think about it, but it's because we're excluding all those teen births who would pull our average back down to the number that we would expect. And these data are really nice because they're based on the fertility and relationship history file that the Ohio State University Center for Human Research actually constructed and cleaned. And so they're much cleaner data than you often have when you're studying fertility. But one thing I do want to mention before I go to our height and weight data is that you have to keep in mind that our results are really only representative of U.S. women in this particular birth cohort who didn't have a teen birth. And so we're really talking about what goes on with weight for young adult women over the life course. Our primary independent variable of interest is women's weight classification in 1981 when they were young adults. And we calculated BMI from height and weight using the standard formulas. And then we classify using people's BMI, women's BMI into categories for underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese. And again, when you look at that obese category, we see this fairly small proportion of women who are obese. This is, again, because it's 1981, we've excluded all the teenagers, and we excluded all the people that had early births. And so when we look at those numbers against the NHANES data, which is another U.S. data set you can use to kind of capture, well, what proportion of women should be obese at this time frame. When you make those same constraints, the numbers match up pretty well. So they work for our sample, but again, keep this in mind in terms of how representative our findings are. They're representative for women who didn't have births before age 20 in this particular cohort. What else would I say? Okay, so these are the control variables. I'm not going to go into detail about how we constructed or coded any of them unless anyone's particularly interested. Control variables, in this particular study, we use them mainly just to kind of get rid of the noise and get clearer estimates of how weight actually matters. And again, you might notice that what's not on here are all of those different classes of fertility determinants that I talked about as important earlier.
Just explain that AFQT score.
The AFQT is kind of the equivalent of like an IQ score that you get. It's kind of like the military test of knowledge test that people take in the U.S. And so it's kind of a proxy for IQ or intelligence. So. But in this paper, basically, that's the study I'm going to show you here, the theory is just that. It's the theory. And we're now working on process in the next couple of papers. And so I'm not going to get into that today. But I can talk to you about some of it. We've already done the fertility exposure. The problem is it's quite hard to measure those biological processes and the social processes together in one data set. And so that's where we're kind of still trying to find creative ways to do both together. But I can talk about what we found for fertility exposure at the end. But again, that's not in this talk. That's in the next paper. So that's actually under review right now. So. Methods. So I'm going to present some results from a couple of different methods. First, I'm going to show you just some very descriptive analyses. What does childbearing look like for women in these different weight categories? Just how many kids do people actually have? And then we used basic logistic regression models to examine the way that weight was related to childlessness. And then we also used hazard regression models to examine timing of first birth. And we used the survey weights to make sure that our analyses are, we wait for the sample distribution and our sampling frame of the analyst by 79. Okay. So, before I show you the fancy pictures and the fancy tables, I always like to kind of do an overview of what we found. The good news is, it's always good when you do research and it's theoretically grounded, you go, yay, the results largely support what we thought we would find. The obese women in our study have fewer children. They have a much higher probability of remaining childless throughout their lives, and they have a lower hazard of birth across the life course when we look at their timing of first birth. Okay. So what this first figure shows is just basically that there's substantial variation in parity, or the number of children that women have, by weight. Our analysis basically looked at whether or not women had 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more children. And when you look at the white proportion of the bars, these are the women who had no births across their lives. And so when you look at the bar for normal weight women, 26.7% of them had no births. For underweight women, 32%. Those aren't significantly different, those estimates. 33% of the overweight women reported 0 live births. Again, not significantly different from the normal weight women. So there's a little bit of a difference between those bars, but not enough to reach statistical significance. But then all of a sudden you look at the obese women. More than half of them, 55.4% of them, reported 0 live births by the end of the survey. So across 25 years, those women who were obese in 1981 when they were 20 to 24 didn't have a single child. So by that point, they were 45 to 49. Not much of a chance if they haven't had a child by 45 to 49 that they're going to have a kid later. And you also can see, when you look at the top of the graph, sharp differences in terms of having higher order births between obese women and the other counterparts. So the solid black line at the top, that's basically indicating whether or not whether a woman had 4 or more births. Most women don't want to have 4 kids in the United States, but just the fact that you look at that and you go, not a single obese person in our study had 4 kids. And there are at least small proportions in every other weight category who did. You also see much smaller proportions of women who have 3 births. So you're seeing this substantial variation in the number of kids women are having, with obese women consistently having fewer single births, fewer second births, fewer third births, and no fourth births relative to the women in the other weight categories. So this is basic descriptives. No control variables taken account for. Just let's look at the crosstab and see what we find. So when we move on to some multivariate models, and again, I'm not showing the control variables because I know when I look at tables and there are 27 variables, and then my eyes always kind of go, and I totally gloss over. And so I always present my main. You're welcome. I always just present my main effects, but if you want to know more about the control variables, I can pull up the tables on the computer later. And so Model A shouldn't be surprising. That's basically kind of just showing what we showed in the last pretty picture without control. So Model A, there are no control variables. And it's just kind of underscoring the difference between obese women and normal weight women in terms of the number of births you have. And again, with this idea that, and whether or not you had a child at all. And so the underweight women, overweight women, they pretty much no significant difference between them and normal weight women in remaining childless over the course of their lives. Obese women, much lower likelihood of having kids, or much higher likelihood, of remaining childless across their lives. Model B, we put all the confounders in and go, okay, let's see, if we control for all of this noise that we think might interfere with this estimate, what happens? And again, we see obese women having a much higher likelihood of remaining childless across the life course. And in fact, what we ended up doing is we took the estimates from these models and we plugged them into formulas and came up with predicted probabilities to kind of get some idea of how different obese women were from the non-obese women in our sample. And what we end up finding is that basically obese women's likelihood of having a child, of having a remaining childless, this is where, it's like, sorry, it's 8 o'clock on the East Coast. I'm going to take another swig of coffee. But basically, their likelihood of having a child is about the same as winning or losing a coin toss. It's basically 50-50. So those aren't such great odds of ever having a kid. And in terms of thinking, wow, I really want a kid, or at least in the U.S., most women want kids. And in fact, we have models where we looked at fertility expectations and said, okay, let's only look at women who want kids. Estimates very much play out the same way. They basically have very low odds, and you could flip a coin, and that's about you're as likely to win that coin toss as you are to have a child. So the next thing we asked is, in demography and in the fertility literature, there's a lot of research that kind of shows, well, whether or not you remain childless really depends in large part on when you actually start to try and have kids and on your timing of first birth. If you wait till 40 to have your first kid, you're unlikely to have a second kid because you're kind of just going to run out. So the later you delay childbearing, the more likely you are to remain childless. So when we look at those models, we again kind of find sort of analogous findings, with obese women having delayed fertility relative to their non-obese peers. And again, I'm going to kind of skip over this. It's the same idea in Model A. We don't control for anything. Model B, we control for the basic covariates you'd expect to be confounders. You don't see much movement in the coefficient across those models. But our findings, I think, are much easier to interpret when you look at this graph. And so this is, again, when we plot the hazard of first birth by weight based on that model where we account for confounders. And the lower line there with the squares, that's the hazard of first birth for the obese women in our sample. And what you can see is across the life course, across that 25-year period in our data, their hazard of birth is always consistently lower than their non-obese peers. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to say? No. So that's the basic gist. And so we think our study makes several important contributions to thinking about relationships between women's weight and childbearing. So first, to our knowledge, this is a first study to really develop some sort of conceptual model to think about the way that weight might be biologically and socially pressing on childbearing across the life course and not at just one point in time. And so we're bringing the biology and the social together, at least we're trying. And also thinking in terms of a life course framework instead of this single moment in time, are obese women having kids or not? The model is based on theory and prior research from across academic disciplines, and I like that a lot. If there was one thing that happened to me as a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society scholar, it's that I realized that if we all just kind of took the knowledge from around the world, we'd get much greater, bigger pictures about what's actually going on in terms of health and social processes. And I like this idea that this framework that is largely based in demography allows us to pull in sociology, it allows us to pull in public health, it allows us to pull in research from the obstetrics and gynecology world, and kind of weave it together to get this much richer picture about how weight matters for women's long-term fertility trajectories. And our findings largely supported our hypotheses, and what they do is they provide a nice descriptive snapshot of obesity as a central feature of young women's lives that stratifies them into a different life course childbearing experiences than their non-obese peers. And by estimating a couple of different outcomes here, the study speaks to the ways that weight may be related to the total fertility rates for the most recent U.S. birth cohort with near completed childbearing histories. And the results clearly show to us that underweight, normal weight, and overweight women all have similar adult childbearing trajectories with respect to the number of children they bear, when they start to have kids, and whether or not they actually have a child. But obese women are really quite different. On average, they have fewer children than their non-obese peers. Their predicted probability of remaining childless is much higher, and their timing of first birth is actually much different. And so, of course, any time that you present a study like this, you have to think about the findings within limitations. So first of all, there's definitely a historical context to these findings. When you think about the way that the obesity epidemic has kind of taken off in the United States, the 1980s are really when obesity was kind of starting to explode. And so these are women that were obese at a time in history where it was still not nearly as common to be obese as it is now. And so we might expect to find now that obesity is not quite as problematic because, well, there are more obese partners for women, there are more obese women. Well, then maybe weight doesn't matter as much because maybe fertility exposure isn't hampered as much as it was back in the day. We've done some relatively recent analysis of the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health that suggests that it's still a pretty big problem. So it's not as much of a problem. It varies by, there are some contextual features to those findings. I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. But we still see obesity causing some problems for young women. The other thing is we measure BMI using self-reported height and weight data. Unfortunately, the NLSY 79 is a labor market study. They kind of threw obesity in there on a whim because there was some evidence coming up that, obesity seems to impact economic outcomes, and they weren't really interested in these really precise health measures. So we have some error, most likely, in our height and weight data because women tend to underreport their weight, and women also tend to overestimate their height. And so then when you get their BMI, they actually would be much leaner than they may be if you actually physically measured them. Now, the good thing that means for us, though, is we're actually probably underestimating our effects because we have fewer obese women in this category than we might expect, and some obese women are probably in that overweight category and muddying the waters. And so, if anything, this bias is just kind of a downward bias of our estimates, which, I'll take more conservative any day over less conservative. And so we see that as less problematic than it might be. And there's also this wonderful economist. I know sociologists don't always like economists. But there's this wonderful economist at Cornell named John Cawley who has some methods to correct self-reported data on height and weight, and we've used some of his methods, and it doesn't really matter, so in the end we just kind of go back to the simpler method. But when we kind of correct the way he suggests, we get pretty analogous findings to what we show here. And the other thing is that, there's some sample selection and purposeful non-follow-up here. So these are women that didn't have teen births. So they're different than a national study. These are women who, they were followed the entire survey wave. So there's definitely a little bit of selection in here in terms of who's left probably people that are a little bit more privileged. And so our findings probably apply a little bit more to people. In fact, we've looked, and our sample is slightly more educated, and not like to the point where they're super elite, but there's a little bit of bias in terms of who's left in our sample. And so our findings should be interpreted with respect to those limitations. But the take-home message is that obesity clearly mattered for a recent cohort of women's life course childbearing experiences, and they were totally disadvantaged. There's this group of women, this cohort of women in the United States, who, if they were heavy, they were kind of left out. And also, I was telling you before that there was an analysis done, it was presented at the American Sociological meetings, that these women were also a lot less likely to get married too. And we've done some follow-up analysis to show that that's the case too. That so you have this group of women in the early 1980s that were obese, that were not getting married and were not having kids, and were kind of left out of the U.S. family formation landscape. And so, it's just kind of important to think about weight as something, it's not just this massive health issue, it's also a really big social issue, especially for women. So some ongoing research questions, and this is just kind of a little preview. Please invite me back to UBC someday, and I'll talk to you more about my research. Or, come and check me out at ASA, or come to Penn State and talk to me, and I'll tell you more about my research. But so some of the ongoing questions that we're trying to answer is whether weight similarly impacts all women. And our preliminary results suggest that the answer is very likely to be no. And so I have another study that I've been working on with a graduate student, which hopefully is going to go back out the door when I get back. I sent her back my revisions. I think we have one more round of revisions left. And in that study, we actually show, we focus more on teenagers using a more recent cohort, and we can show that obese girls embedded in different types of schools have different likelihoods of becoming teen mothers. And so obese teenagers in general, really low likelihood of becoming pregnant because they're unlikely to date, they're unlikely to have sex. But you take that woman and you embed her in a school with a lot of other heavy kids, and she's actually more likely to have a baby than the non-obese kids in that school. And in large part, you're starting to kind of pull apart that process, and it's because there's also some research that shows that when obese teenagers do have sex, they have risky sex and they don't protect themselves. But what this also means is that when you can kind of show this contextual effect going on, and the fact that weight doesn't operate the same in these different social contexts, to us it's more evidence that these aren't just biological processes going on, and that weight also matters socially, and the social processes in the landscape matter a lot too. We also have some evidence that these findings are not as strong for recent cohorts as earlier cohorts. And so when we parse out different birth cohorts, Maggie and I actually have a paper coming out in Social Science and Medicine that shows that looking across a life course, across different cohorts of women, that you still find this going on, but not as dramatically for newer cohorts of women than younger cohorts of women. And again, that's where the younger cohorts, you have to look at where they're embedded, and that matters more. The other thing that matters a lot, we think, these findings are more tentative, and so I wouldn't take them to the bank yet, is that there are racial and ethnic variations in the way that weight matters for women. For Hispanics and African Americans, we don't seem to find the same strong relationship that we do for whites, and this makes sense because normative expectations for beauty vary quite a bit, at least in the United States, according to racial and ethnic backgrounds. The other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to parse out the pathways linking weight to life course childbearing. So we have another paper that we're in the process of trying to finish up that kind of says, okay, can we pull out can we kind of go through process? And like I said before, as far as we can tell, there are no data sets that we can find anywhere where we can kind of look over time at biology and the social stuff. And so what we decided to try and do is go, okay, but what we can do is we can start to look at early life weight, and we can say, well, how does that press on marriage? How does that press on timing of first birth? How does that press on timing of higher order births? And is there this way that we can over time go, well, now let's go at the end and throw in these other pieces of the trajectory, and will they explain this association? And we can kind of show that, yeah, that's what happens. And we can kind of show, we can't get on it as cleanly as I'd like through those boxes, but we can show that, yes, when you start to control for the fact that women push back marriage, they have delayed first births, yeah, you can kind of understand the life course nature of these processes going on. And then the other thing that we haven't touched yet, but we'd like to over time, the methods to do so are a lot more complicated, and Maggie is in a soft money position, so we need to find some more money so that we can work on this in time. But fortunately, I'll be on sabbatical next year in California with her, and we'll be working some of this on, is the reciprocal and cyclical nature of the relationship between weight and fertility, because we know that when women have kids, they tend to gain a little weight, and you gain a little, and so we kind of want to start to think more about the way that weight, fertility, and marriage are intertwined. But for us, this is on large part, all of this is motivated by the idea that weight is just this really rich measure of both health and social status. And so the way it's going to press on and impact both men's and women's lives over time is going to be a lot more complex than just basically thinking about the fact that people are going to have a heart attack at age 50. And with that, I want to thank you very much for listening. I've given this talk. I told Rich I gave the 7-minute version, and I gave this talk 2 other times recently. And he said, well, how long is it? And I said, I have no idea, because I was interrupted each talk so many times that it was an hour and 15 minutes later. So I said, I have no idea how long it was. So I still don't know how long it was, but I think we have plenty of time for questions. And so I am happy to answer any questions you may have for me. And thank you. Sure.
I'm wondering if you actually looked at whether they stayed obese throughout their adult life in their 25 years.
We did not. What I can tell you, in terms of how that mattered, in terms of thinking about how long are you obese?
See how many of them actually stayed obese throughout.
Yes, that we have. Yeah, almost all of them. And in fact, what you end up seeing, that was the other nice thing. In fact, I had that embedded. I just didn't, because I always go off script when I talk. And for the most part, the way that weight trajectories work is they increase through midlife and then they start to go down, but they actually really only go down because women start to lose muscle mass. And so you see a lot more people moving into the obese category than you do moving out. I think, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but just when you compare just simply like weight in 1981 and weight in 2006, it's something like 3% of the women move to normal weight and only 15% move to overweight. And so for the most part, these women stay heavy, and they actually have more friends joining them. So, yeah. But that is one of the things, that's why we want to start to parse out the way the trajectory matters in terms of, well, are these women that are accumulating weight at a greater disadvantage? Or are these women who aren't necessarily, maybe they're just overweight here, and if they gain weight over time, how does that matter? And we're not there in the project yet. So, but it's a nice thing about having 26 waves of data is that over time, we'll eventually get there, we hope. Yeah, Chris?
I've got a couple of questions. I'll ask my geeky statistical question first. What was the hazard function that you used to estimate your probabilities there?
Do you mean, we just used a basic hazard model and assumed that I have a footnote. Maggie did the hazard analyses. Huh? No. Give me one second. I have that note here because I gave this talk to economists. I just went. No. I just have to get back to the methods. Or do you want to ask? Why don't you ask the other question while I look?
Okay, yeah. So this is not a question of economists for that, so I'll repeat myself.
I'm fine. No, it's fine.
And you talk about the sexual factor, and you talk about the sexual factor. You're talking about essentially people being around other people who are also obese.
Yes.
But obviously, the sexual factors are much richer than that in terms of how people respond to the context and how they feel about being obese in context. That might deal with all three of your pathways. So I'm just wondering, you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you get conceptualize how the context would matter along those pathways. I realize you can't necessarily test that.
For all of those pathways?
Well, just perhaps you don't have to do all of them, but just maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Could you put your model up too?
Yeah. Yeah. And then I'll find the hazard function. I mean, we use a pretty basic hazard function. It's just, rather than using an actual hazard model, we manipulate the data and then use the logistic function to...
Okay.
So does that...
Yeah.
Yeah. And we relaxed and unrelaxed the proportional hazards assumption and get the same findings. Is that... Okay. Sorry. Is that good?
Oh, the earlier one.
Or you want to go back to there?
That was more related to your question. But yeah, I'll just go to that one.
So you want to know more about how context, for instance, would influence the way that weight pushes on fertility exposure?
Yeah, or natural fertility control, deliberative fertility control.
We've largely only thought about it in terms of how you're surrounded by other obese individuals, and that's because for the most part, there's a lot of evidence that shows, how do people partner? It's by weight homogamy. It's by a homogamy of a lot of different.
Right.
But so we kind of draw, and that's how we have gone. If there's some other particular contextual factor you want us to talk about, I mean to think about, I can. But I can say that I would say you're surrounded by more heavy people, you're going to be more likely to date, you're going to be more likely to get married. There is already research that shows that when you look at natural fertility control, and this isn't context, but it's couples within a couple dyad, which is just, one step up in terms of thinking about partners rather than individuals. When you have heavy partners trying to conceive, you're really at a massive disadvantage because heavy men have lower sperm motility and sex doesn't happen as often. There are all these other ways that if you have two obese people together, you're at a double disadvantage. I don't think context, in terms of thinking about the proportion of obese people around you, I don't think context would actually influence the biology in any particular way other than perhaps, and this is all kind of now in the way I think the world works, but I don't know how I could ever bear it out. That because you should be able to find a partner earlier in your life, maybe just your general fecundity is higher, and so you wouldn't see as much of a push on ovulation failure, necessarily maybe miscarriage, because if you're partnering young, but again, and that goes back to you have to get there to get there. But that's the only way I can think about the weight context and that, because that's largely biology, and I don't think the context would matter as much here. I think it would matter over here, and it would matter over here. And I can speak a little bit to, I have a colleague at Penn State, his name's Derek Krager. We are actually going to start to look at dyad data in terms of weight homogamy and the way that, then this is with adolescents, obese boys and girls being embedded in different types of school type, the way those partners being embedded in different types of school types influences sexual risk behavior. But we are just in the really super early stages of that. But the basic gist that we think is that obese women may be more likely to, for instance, insist on using contraception if they're in a relationship with somebody else who is also obese, and if they're not, then the power dynamics will shift. And within schools, if there's more of a chance that they could be left for a partner that's not obese, then they'll be less likely to demand that there's contraception used. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I would think about the context mattering. Yeah.
I guess I'll continue on the line of context. I guess I'm just interested if you could provide more detail about what are the characteristics of schools in which a higher proportion of students are obese. I guess I can sort of jump to conclusions about where they would fall in terms of socioeconomic status. I guess concentration of race would be more an issue in the States.
In that particular paper, so we did two things. We, in those models, controlled for the school racial and ethnic composition, school socioeconomic status, school region, public-private, average school achievement level, thinking that in schools where achievement was generally higher and there would be more success and people wouldn't engage in sex just in general. And so we both controlled for everything we could think might confound the proportion of obese kids in schools mattering. We also looked at whether or not it mattered if we looked at just proportion of obese girls versus just proportion of obese boys, thinking that, well, if it has to do with competition for partners, proportion of obese girls should matter. If it has to do more with partnership and homography, proportion of obese girls should matter. When you look at the schools, you don't have enough of a variation where you have slants that you can pull apart which matters more, because you're looking at the same schools. This is what we ended up finding. But none of those confounders changed that cross-level interaction that we found in terms of, I might actually even be able to show you that. Well, I'll see if I can find the graph in a second. I might have it on my laptop. But then the other thing we did is we said, okay, well, let's just kind of think through, could it be that some other school characteristic is actually just a proxy? And so we did cross-level interactions, for instance, between obese and proportion of African Americans in school, proportion, and those interactions didn't pop. It was the obesity one that popped. So, not pop, that's very unstatistically savvy to talk about it that way. But we only found the interaction with the weight context variable, not with the school education variable or SES variable. So we're pretty confident it's actually about the schools. And we, in that paper, we relied pretty heavily on Glass and McAtee's risk regulation theory and the notion that, when you have contextual features of environments, they might not matter in and of themselves, but they constrain or relax the risk that certain individual risk behaviors have on outcomes. And so that's the framework for that paper. And if I can find the graph, I'll show it to you afterwards. But it's actually pretty cool. So, in fact, I don't think Jen would care. Do I have the paper? No, I just have the letter, I think. I'll look for it afterwards. I don't think I have it on my desktop. But yeah, you can just kind of see this line where it crosses, and all of a sudden the obese girls, once you get to a certain proportion of schools that are obese, that they're just this super high-risk group that you wouldn't expect because obese girls aren't generally dating. So, but then if they do date, then they're participating in some relatively high-risk behavior relative to their peers. So, other questions? I didn't mean to pull my talk back up.
I can't remember all of your controls. Did you control for health issues?
We didn't, and this is why. Because one of the problems with the NLSY 79 is they don't ask those questions till women are in their 40s. And so we can only control for the confounding once they're to the point where they're not generally having kids anymore. So, and we wanted to control on mental health, we wanted to control on physical health. And so there's this one question that they ask early on in the study, and it's not even in 1981, it's like in 1986. But it was close enough for, well, let's see what we can do. And it's, do you have a health condition that limits your ability to work? Which is 3% of the sample, because not that many 20-somethings have a health condition that limits their ability to work. And if they do, it's unlikely to be related to disability, to obesity, especially in the 80s. In our analyses of that health, we do control on that, and obesity still matters. So, but again, they're younger, and so you wouldn't expect them to be having like health-related problems related to obesity that would influence fertility in the same way. So, but yeah, we're kind of stuck on that NLSY because it's a labor market survey. It was only later, as they were starting to age, that they really started to care about health. Yeah.
What's the reason for controlling for? I'm sort of naive to this area. To control for the mother's educational attainment.
That mainly just has to do with fertility and the idea that mothers who are more highly educated they're more likely to have daughters that are more highly educated. They were more likely to have kids later, and so their kids are also more likely to have kids later. So it has to do more with the fertility side of things than the weight side of things. Although also girls whose mothers are more highly educated are also more likely to be lean. So there is that, but in this study it was mainly more about the fertility. Yeah.
Were you able to stratify your analysis by poverty status or any other SES?
We did stratify it by poverty status and couldn't find nothing. It was not interesting. So we were also, though, able to show, we to some degree, we could only look at weight and fertility by race, so we couldn't deal with any other confounders. And we actually saw, and this is reported in the paper that's going to come out in Social Science and Medicine soon, you see these same patterns for African Americans that you do for whites. And again, this is adult fertility, so you get rid of all the early births. And we don't have enough Hispanics, which is the other ethnic minority group in the NLSY 79. You can kind of see the pattern, but the cell sizes are so small that we're hesitant to say anything about it.
Did you see any regional differences? No. Consistent?
No. But part of that... No. But part of that, again, you got to keep this in mind. It was really hard. We're finding more variation when we look at health. But that is largely because, I'm going to just pull the slideshow back up. Sorry about that. It's a really small cell size. So you're trying to do an interaction between this, and because it's not a giant sample with constraints, it's only 1,400 plus women. So we're running into power issues, and that's why, like, when we did the stratification by race and ethnicity, we're like, well, we can't do anything. The reviewers are like, this has to be different by race and ethnicity. This is all we can show you, and it's in an appendix now, but it works pretty much the same. But there's major power issues with this because it's still back before it's at the beginning of the obesity epidemic.
Did you try using different categories or even like a linear BMI?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
And it's the same.
It's pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, in the other paper that's about to come out, because we look at timing of first birth, timing of second birth, and we limit those like time. To look at timing of second birth, you have to have had a first birth, and so then once you get rid of those women that didn't have first births, you have to use BMI because you don't have anybody anymore in your sample. You just have such problems in the tails. So we use a squared term, and I can show you the paper if you're interested. But yeah, we get pretty analogous results with. But they're largely what we can also see with the squared term is they're being driven by the tail. So the weight category, it's really something in the upper distribution that matters.
Just a sort of footnote question. What was the logic of controlling for IQ?
The logic of controlling for IQ it comes from fertility research, is that there's a camp of fertility type people that really think that intelligence matters in terms of timing of birth. And so it was more to push on the idea of trying to get rid of other factors that might influence when women are having babies.
How well does that correlate with education?
Not well, but it's one of those people that analyze the NLSY data and estimate fertility. It's one of those you better have the variables in your model kind of variables.
Yeah.
So with the variables in our model.
So how did you get that variable? Like people self-reported it, or they actually took?
They actually took the test.
They took the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a pretty low bar. So it's not like the greatest. In terms of like you're not capturing brilliance. You're capturing. Ooh my. Yeah.
Not condition of the army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Just to follow up on that sort of question to be with this. So you said it was small cell size about who actually changed weight, and it was pretty. Is there still enough to? I'm kind of curious. It seems to me that that's almost like a bit of a quasi-experiment for your for some of the tests of some of your ideas here. Do the people who lose weight catch up to the ones who?
We agree.
Yeah.
We're just not there yet.
Okay.
We're just not there yet, because then you also have to think about, okay, well, when did they lose weight? Did they have a baby in that process? And so that's where you start to get into this idea that the weight trajectories and the fertility trajectories kind of go like this across each other.
Sure.
And so it's going to require some.
How long a lag, and the other thing.
And it's going to require some pretty. And we, like 3 years ago, it was actually the first paper we presented, and it went over so poorly that we were like, okay, we need to work on the methodology for this, and we went back to a baseline of like. Let's start from the beginning and think about baseline and what happens with one set of trajectories. But we had done some switching regression models to try and get an idea of, well, does weight influence fertility more? Fertility influence weight more? What happens when you control on previous fertility or previous weight? And those models were not so highly received. So we decided to kind of wait and go back to basics. So, yeah. But the models did show that weight pushes fertility more than fertility pushes weight, which is consistent with some other research in the medical world that shows that, well, women might gain weight when they have babies, but most women, like I've had 2 kids, and I'm probably 3 pounds heavier than I was, 3. But most people don't go from like normal weight to obese.
Well, I was even thinking like the first, if you were going to restrict the same, you probably get such a small cell size, but trying to look at even
people who lose weight
before the first kid, and then compare that.
Right, and that's what I mean. So you have to look at
normal weight over time, and then
right.
Yeah.
And it's the whole thing with time and the
counterfactual here.
It gets really messy, and that's why we went. You know what?
Yeah.
We're going to start, and we're going to build on this piece by piece.
Yeah.
And go back to the beginning.
And kudos to you with sort of unpacking it first. And sort of, you get so many different pathways.
Yeah, but that was actually the paper that Maggie and I worked on when we were still at Wisconsin together.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. And then we went, you know what? That's not going to work yet because nobody's going to, at the time, I mean, we were still relatively junior. We're like, we don't have the credibility yet to go there. And so stepping back. Yeah.
Is that the advice you have if you're thinking about the trajectory model?
Well, I think it depends. I think it's when you have trajectories on trajectories. And when they're bidirectional, like if you have trajectories that both kind of go in the same way. But I think trajectories are just generally hard. There's a lot of controversy over which methodology is best. By the time you get there, you have these really technical people reviewing your papers, and because they're technical, they're in different camps. And sometimes, like, for most stuff that people want to do trajectories on, to really understand the trajectories, you have to think about the beginning too. And so it's kind of, I mean, what I always tell my students is, well, you don't start with the fifth paper. You start with the first paper, and then you figure out the first paper, and then from there you build on the second, and then from the second to the third. So you do get to the trajectories, but if you write those first three papers first, then you have the credibility to really figure out the trajectories. So, or you can do the big giant tome. But I don't kind of operate in the world of doing the big giant tome all at one. You know, I've learned, and I think too because I've kind of, like Rich was talking about, my career kind of goes like this. It's like, well, first I was doing family, then I did education, and so there's this way that I weave in and out of areas. And so I definitely have learned that you have to kind of establish some credibility at a base before then people go, oh yeah, no, you're definitely going to be able to make this next job. At least, I should say at least with NIH, National Institute of Health funders in the United States, that's definitely the case. So if you want National Institute of Health money, I don't know if the...
CHO is the same way.
Okay, there you go. So yes. So my advice would not be to not do it. It would be to start simple and build, I guess. So.
Keep it simple, stupid? Is that what the old adage?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Is that advice? Okay.
But he's not stupid, I would never say.
No, yeah.
Keep it simple, smarty.
My students.
Keep it simple, smarty. So, because then you even look smarter. Anything else?
No questions?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to stick around a couple more minutes and answer any other individual questions you might have. And this was actually a lot of fun. So thank you very, very much for having me.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.